This introductory video to GCSE Film Studies will give an overview of exactly what we'll be studying over the 2 years. One of the key areas to be thinking about is how we develop our knowledge and understanding of 1. How films are constructed, for instance through cinematography, which is camera work and lighting, mise en scène, which is just a fancy phrase for how sets, locations, props and costume are used in film, editing and sound. Also, how films are organised into structures, for instance genre, the different kinds of film such as horror, comedy, thriller, and narrative, how films tell their stories. How films can be used. They can be used artistically, so the aesthetic qualities of film, for its own sake and love of something beautiful, and as a way of communicating ideas and issues through an aspect of representation, for instance, of say representation of racism or sexism or something else in society that's bad. How learners make sense of film through exploring a film's relevant context, such as social, cultural, historical, political and institutional, through an awareness of key aspects of the history of film and through specialist writing on film. This learning progression from the key elements of film form to recognising how context and writing on film can deepen understanding will be explored in this subject across a range of films. 2 core study areas will be studied in relation to all films. These are 1. The key elements of film form, which involves looking at cinematography, mise en scène, editing and sound, and also the context of film, which includes social, cultural, historical, technological, institutional and, where relevant, political context of film. And remember, as we say in class, context is basically a fancy word for background information. So the background information that helps us understand something better. Some films will have an additional focus beyond these core study areas. For instance, the global English language film will focus additionally on narrative. The global non-English language film will focus additionally on representation. The contemporary UK film, which is what we studied when we looked at Submarine, will focus additionally on a film's aesthetic qualities, its style basically. The US independent film will be studied in relation to specialist writing on film set by WJT, or EduCast in our case, in order to enable students to deepen their understanding of film, it says. And our US independent film is a film called Juno. The comparison of 2 US films from the past will be studied in a way that will focus on comparing the films in terms of genre, narrative and context. And that's the one that we're currently doing in class at the moment, which is looking at Rebel Without Cause and Ferris Bueller's Day Off. So one set in the 50s, which is a very different time to now, and also Ferris Bueller's Day Off, which is set in the 80s, which is again very different from now, and both films are very different from each other. They both represent America in 2 completely different historical periods. Studying film. Core study areas. Learners will study each of their 6 films using the following core study areas. So by core study areas, this means these are really, really important to get your head around because they involve everything that we do. They're the core, so they're very essence of everything we study, every single film. These 2 key areas are very important. And we've introduced them in class already. 1. Key elements of film form. Cinematography, mise en scène, editing and sound. 2. The context of film. Social, cultural, historical, political and institutional, including key aspects of the history of film and film technology. 1. Key elements of film form. Film can be explored for its detail, for example, through the technical elements such as individual shots, locations, sound or editing, which are all used to make a film, or through the ways these are organised into larger structures, for instance in genre and narrative. The formal way of describing these technical elements is cinematography, which includes lighting, mise en scène, editing and sound. In this course, these are termed the key elements of film form. The ability to analyse how these key elements of film form create meaning, both on their own and together with other films perhaps, is a core skill in film studies at all levels. You will need to understand the following aspects of cinematography, mise en scène, editing and sound, and be able to explore them in relation to the films you study. Cinematography, including lighting. Camera shots, So including extreme close-ups, medium shots, long shots, extreme long shots, high angles, low angles, 60-degree angle shots, so off-center shots, tilt and aerial shots taken from above, basically like a bird's eye view. Camera movement, including pan, tracking, dolly, and the use of Steadicam technology. Lighting, including position and intensity. Framing created through distance, angle, level, and mobility, so moving around, and how it directs the spectator attention. So spectator means the audience. The typical meanings associated with all the above aspects of cinematography, including lighting. How each of the above contributes to the portrayal of characters and settings. So just to give you an example, low lighting, so dark, shadowy lighting, could make a character look sinister, like usually a villain is usually portrayed that way. How cinematography can combine with mise-en-scène or sound to underline meaning. So again, to build on that idea I just mentioned, so a bad guy shown in shadowy lighting and sort of sinister music playing over the top, we go, oh, that's a bad guy. How each of the above generates spectator responses. Again, literally what I just said. So the idea is that the audience, who the spectator, goes, oh, he must be evil because he's seen in shadow and this sinister music, dun dun dun, sort of playing. Mise-en-scène, settings, props, costume and makeup. The typical meanings associated with each of the above aspects of mise-en-scène. How mise-en-scène conventionally conveys realism. So what that basically means is how actually the use of lack of lighting and sort of more documentary style. So realism means as realistic looking as possible, so not Hollywood in other words, so it's not like beautifully lit. The sound is kind of all over the place, so it's almost documentary style. All right. How settings contribute to the themes and issues a film raises. So for instance, a film that we're going to be looking at is called The Wave, and that's set in Germany. And so the themes and issues of the film, basically it's set in a German classroom in a school, and it links to the idea of Nazism and the idea of fascism. It's a really great film that we'll be looking at, and it's about how the students of a German school think fascism could never be brought back in the same way as Nazism, and the teacher actually goes through a way of brainwashing them to prove the point that actually, no, you're actually wrong, and that fascism could very well come back. And it's a very, very interesting film. How props contribute to the character and or narrative development in the film studied. So in other words, like how props such as devices, objects, clothing contribute to how we understand the character, or indeed the story's development, the narrative development of the film. How costume and makeup convey character. How each of the above aspects of mise-en-scène generates spectators' responses. So a good way of looking at that is like, okay, so how a character is dressed and how are they looking or dressed, makes us respond in a certain way, because in society we tend to judge people by the way they look, even if that's not right, it isn't right, but that's just a human response. We generally see someone and we have like an immediate emergent response inside, and we have an idea of who they are, even if that's not what they really like. Editing. Types of edit: cut, dissolve, fade. The principles of continuity editing: shot, reverse shot. So continuity editing we take for granted. That's basically any editing in most films where we almost don't see the editing. It's almost invisible because we're just paying attention to the story. Cross-cutting, for instance, from one place to the next. If it's to two different locations, cutting from one location to another location in a film. The pace of editing, so fast editing for action sequences, slower editing for more like conversational pieces, say between characters. Visual effects created in post-production. The typical meanings associated with all the above aspects of editing. How continuity editing establishes relationships between characters. How cross-cutting contributes to the portrayal of character. How editing contributes to narrative development in the film studied. How editing, including visual effects, generates spectator responses. Sound. Diegetic and non-diegetic sound, including ambient sound, sound effects and sound bridges. So that's worth breaking down. So diegetic sound is any sound that goes into the microphone as you're filming. So like for instance, me talking now is going into a microphone, so that's diegetic sound. Any other sounds like environmental sounds, so if there's cars going by or the school pips go or anything like that, that's diegetic sound because it's coming from the real world. Non-diegetic sound is sounds such as when you put music over the top, when you edit in Adobe Premiere Pro and you add, let's say, music or any sound effects, any sounds that weren't recorded when you were filming, and you add to your film or anyone adds to their film, that's non-diegetic sound. So this also includes ambient sound. So ambient sound is sound that's around, basically. That's more diegetic. Sound effects and sound bridges are done in editing, so that would be non-diegetic. The typical meanings associated with diegetic sound, including how it contributes to character and narrative development. So that could be dialogue, for instance, or the tone of their voice. For instance, in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Cameron's very droning and he's depressed sound, and his voice is very worried all the time, and he goes a bit high pitched and stuff like that. The typical meanings associated with non-diegetic sound, including how music motifs conveys character and different types of music contribute to the narrative. In a nutshell, that's all very fancy, but what it basically means is, like I said before, how music can cue our emotion. So it's like really sinister music, we think maybe a character is evil. Or it's very light-hearted and upbeat, we think, oh, this guy's nice, or this woman's nice. It prepares us an emotional cue. How non-diegetic sound in particular contributes to the themes and the issues a film raises. So that can be music or maybe voiceover even. How sound, particularly music, whether diegetic or non-diegetic, generates spectator responses in the film studied. So again, and that's really powerful. I mean, most films do that. They use maybe sad music or angry music or something like that, and it cues our emotions. It's actually telling us a lot of the time how we should feel in a certain scene. 2. The context of film. A film is influenced by the various contexts in which it is produced. Films reflect and respond to the social, cultural, political, technological and institutional context in which they are made, whether that is the present or the past, the historical context. Apart from institutional and technological context, it is a film's narrative which most obviously reflects a film's context. When films are set in the past, such as Singing in the Rain, Grease and Dracula in the specification, or in our case, Rebel Without Cause, learners should focus on the context of the narrative, so when the film is set. Relating their chosen films to the history of film and film technology is a further important context learners need to consider. Learners will thus need to study how their chosen films reflect the context in which they are made. This includes study of the social context, so that's aspects of society and its structure reflected in the film. Cultural context, aspects of culture, ways of living, beliefs and values of groups of people reflected in the film. Historical context, aspects of the society and culture at the time when films are made and, where relevant, when they are set. Political context, the way political issues, when relevant to the film chosen, are reflected in a film. Technological context, the technologies reflected in a film's production and, in some cases, in its narrative. Institutional context, how films are funded, how the level of production budget affects the kind of film made, and the main stages of film production. Key aspects of the history of film and film technology. Students will need to be introduced to the most significant developments in the history of film and film technology, which will include at least the following: the first moving images in silent film, the rise of Hollywood and the development of sound, the introduction of colour film, the emergence of widescreen technology and 3D film, the development of portable cameras and Steadicam technology, the role of computer-generated imagery in film. Studying film. Additional study areas. 4 additional study areas will provide the focus for the study of 3. Narrative, structural element of film form, global English language film. 4. Representation of people and ideas, global non-English language film. 5. Film style, the aesthetic qualities of film, contemporary UK film. 6. Specialist writing on film, including film criticism, US independent film. So let's look at some of these. 3. Narrative, structural element of film form, global English language film. The way the key elements of film form are organised into larger structures, genre and narrative, involves studying films as a whole. Whilst genre will be studied in relation to the US film comparative study, which was obviously Ferris Bueller's Day Off and Rebel Without a Cause, narrative will be studied as a focus area in relation to global English language film. Students will also need to understand how narrative are constructed and be able to recognise the role of the screenplay in establishing the main features of a film's narrative as indicated below. The distinction between plot and story, the role of the screenplay in conveying plot and its realisation in visual terms, cause and effect as a structural principle of narrative, narrative techniques including ellipsis and withholding, releasing of information, for instance, that helps us understand deliberately. So there's a mystery, an enigma code, a mystery that someone's murdered but we don't know who murdered them. Okay, so that's withholding information, makes us want to watch more. Narrative conventions in screenwriting including free act structure, plot points, inciting incident and climax. So in class recently we looked at, say, Todorov's 3 stages of narrative: equilibrium, disequilibrium and restored equilibrium. An interpretation of the narrative, the role of character and character function in narrative, in other words, what's their purpose in the film, how do they push the story along, how all the above bullet points contribute to narrative development. So how does it push the story, develop the story to all through, is it fast, is it slow, the themes and issues raised by narrative, how narrative generates spectator responses. So again, it comes always back to spectator, i.e. the audience's responses. Do they find it funny? Is it sad? Does it make them scared? All right. So that's how the story or the narrative makes that happen. 4. Representation of people and ideas. Global non-English language film. So that's for us the wave again. The images which form the basis of film are never simply pictures of reality, but always provide points of view about what they portray. This is the root of the study of representation, and students will need to study the significance of different representations within the films they study. They will need to explore how their chosen films represent and thus offer particular perspectives on gender, ethnicity, age and different cultures. 5. Film style, the aesthetic qualities of film, contemporary UK film. Although it's not always emphasised, film is an art form. The study of a film's aesthetic qualities, therefore, involves considering how all aspects of film form are combined artistically. In exploring the aesthetic qualities of film, learners may consider, for example, individual shots, their composition, so how they're framed, for instance, and mise en scène in general. So what's in the scene, so body language, performance, facial expressions, costume, location, stuff like that. In some cases, these elements are used throughout a film and create a distinctive look or style. Whether aesthetic effects are momentary or whether there is a distinct aesthetic look to a whole film, learners will be considering whether the spectacle of film engages spectators more than the film's narrative. Learners will need to develop knowledge and understanding of the aesthetics of film, their significance, and how filmmakers create aesthetic effects through specific film sequences. 6. Specialist writing on film, including film criticism, US independent film. And for this we'll be looking at the film Juno. In order to develop and extend their knowledge and understanding of film, learners are required to study specialist writing on film, including film criticism. So that doesn't sound exactly what it sounds like. So we think of criticism as negatives, but actually film criticism, or any sort of criticism in an academic sense, is looking at balancing good and bad, maybe, and thinking about good points of something and the bad points of something, and sort of summarising. This specialist writing will be studied specifically in relation to US independent film and will be set by WJC, who's the exam board. It will consist of one source of cinematography, one source of US independent film, one film review. One review will be set on each of the 5 independent films set by WJEC. In England it's EDUCAS, but in Wales it's WJEC, but it's the same thing. A list of set specialist writing to support learners' study of their chosen US independent film is available on the EDUCAS GCSE Film Studies website. Integrated study of film, including genre, the comparative US film study. So again, this was when we looked at Rebel Without a Cause and Ferris Bueller's Day Off. These study areas will be approached in an integrated synoptic way through the comparative study of 2 US films from the past, one from the 30s or 50s, which was for us Rebel Without a Cause, and one from the 70s or 80s, which again for us was Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Whilst the comparative study will bring together the study areas, emphasis will be placed on a comparison of genre, narrative and context as follows. The structural elements of film form, such as genre and narrative. The relevant context of film, which includes reference to the way films reflect significant developments in the history of film. The key elements of film form, such as cinematography, mise-en-scène, editing and sound. Representation. So the key areas of representation, the representations of people, places, events and issues. The aesthetic qualities of film. Genre, a structural element of film form. Learners will demonstrate a knowledge of a genre in relation to the US comparative study, where each pair of films reflects a specific genre. Through their choice of films, learners will develop an understanding of the following. 1. The concept of genre. 2. The conventions of genre based on iconography, including mise-en-scène, characters, narratives and themes. The significance of genre to film producers and film audiences. So as we discovered in class, it's actually quite hard to nail down, say, the iconography of drama, as in Rebel Without a Cause, and even harder in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, which is a comedy. So comedy and dramas themselves don't lend themselves specifically to iconography in the way, say, horror does, with like knives, castles, blood, monster masks, or maybe sci-fi with like flying saucers, aliens and space guns and stuff like that. Those types of genres are really easily to identify with visual iconography like that. But I'd say teen drama and teen comedy are harder to nail down in terms of visual iconography. In terms of sound though, it can be. So for drama it would be like the sound would be iconographic in terms of, say, dramatic music, and in comedy it'd be like comedic music. And that's it for this introductory video on the overview of the study areas of the GCSE Film Studies course.